Oh, so now they get it. Now they finally understand. Welcome back, you beautiful architects of chaos. You misunderstood strategists. You silent players who've been operating on a level they couldn't comprehend. Yeah, you, the one they called impulsive. The one they labeled emotional. The one they swore was spiraling. Funny how the narrative shifts when the smoke clears. Isn't it funny how crazy suddenly looks like precision when they finally see the board you were playing on while they were stuck on checkers? Let me ask you something. When did you first realize they thought you were losing your mind? Was it when you walked away without explanation? Was it when you stopped arguing back? Was it when you made that move that looked reckless to everyone watching but felt like the only logical choice to you? They panicked, didn't they? Your friends, your family, maybe even people who barely knew you, started whispering, started diagnosing, started placing bets on how long until you crashed and burned. But here's what they didn't see. Here's what they couldn't possibly understand because they've never operated at your frequency. You weren't losing control, you were taking it. Every move that looked chaotic was calculated. Every bridge you burned, you checked the wind direction first. Every person you cut off, you'd already run the projection of your life with them still in it. And you deleted that timeline with surgical precision. They thought you were falling apart, you were falling into place. You see, there's a frequency of intelligence that terrifies people. Because it doesn't announce itself. It doesn't wear credentials. It doesn't need approval from the committee. Clears throat. It just moves. And when it moves, it looks insane to people still trying to predict outcomes using the same broken formulas they've been taught since birth. You stopped playing by their rules and they called it a breakdown. You started playing your own game, and they called it madness. But madness and genius, they've always lived in the same house, haven't they? The only difference is the scoreboard at the end. Let's rewind the tape. Let's go back to that moment. That specific moment when you made the choice that made everyone question your sanity. Maybe you quit the job that looked perfect on paper but was draining your soul like a slow poison. Maybe you ended the relationship that everyone said was so good for you but felt like drowning with an audience. Maybe you disappeared for months without posting, without explaining, without performing the mandatory social media circus that proves you're still alive and participating. They called it erratic. They called it self-destructive. Some of them, the ones who really thought they knew you, they called it a cry for help with that condescending concern dripping from their voices like they were narrators in your tragedy. But you weren't crying for help. You were eliminating distractions. You weren't breaking down. You were breaking through. Clears throat. And the most beautiful part? You didn't need them to understand. You didn't need their permission, their blessing, or their damn opinion. Clears throat. Because here's the thing about calculated risk that safe people will never comprehend. It looks identical to recklessness from the outside. The person who jumps without a visible parachute and the person who jumps knowing exactly where they'll land, they look the same midair. But one of them studied the physics. One of them ran the numbers in the dark while everyone else was asleep, dreaming small dreams in their comfortable cages. You were that person. Clears throat. You are that person. And now they're starting to see it. Now the results are rolling in. Now the life you're building, the person you've become, the peace you're walking in, it's undeniable. And suddenly their tune changes. Suddenly it wasn't crazy. Suddenly it wasn't crazy. Suddenly it was brave. Suddenly you weren't reckless. You were taking a leap of faith. Clears throat. Suddenly the same people who question your sanity are asking for advice, asking how you did it, asking if you can help them make their own bold moves. But you know what's really happening here, don't you? You know what this recognition actually means. It means they're finally catching up to a decision you made months ago, maybe years ago. They're finally arriving at the conclusion you reached while they were still debating in the group chat. They're finally seeing the vision you had when there was nothing but darkness in your own conviction. And that gap, that time gap between when you knew and when they figured it out, that's the proof. That's the proof you were operating on a different level. That's the proof their concern was just fear disguised as care. That's the proof you trusted yourself when you had every logical reason not to. And you were right. You weren't lucky. You weren't reckless. You weren't crazy. You were correct. And being correct before everyone else is what they call genius. Even when they're too proud to use that word directly to your face. Let me tell you what really happened, because they'll never admit this part. When you made that move, when you did that thing that looked insane, something in them recognized it. Something deep in their unconscious knew you were onto something real, clear's throat, something true, something they didn't have the courage to reach for themselves. And that recognition, that brief flash of what if they're right, it terrified them more than anything. Because if you were right, if you're crazy, was actually clarity. Then what did that make them? It made them cowards. It made them complicit in their own mediocrity. It made every safe choice they'd made look like exactly what it was, a surrender to fear dressed up as responsibility. So they had to make you wrong. They had to make you the cautionary tale. They had to turn your boldness into a warning label so they could sleep at night in their prisons of comfort. But you didn't give them that satisfaction, did you? You didn't crash. You didn't burn. You didn't come crawling back with apologies and admissions that they were right all along. Instead, you did something far more devastating. You thrived. You evolved. You became living proof that the path they were too scared to take actually leads somewhere beautiful. And now they have to live with that. Now they have to watch you exist in a reality they told themselves was impossible. And here's the part that really twists the knife. You're not even mad at them anymore. You're not holding grudges. You're not waiting for apologies that will never come. Because somewhere along your journey you realized something that changed everything. Their doubt was never about you. It was always about them. Their fear was always their own. Their need to call you crazy was always their need to feel sane in their own stagnation. So now when they come back, when they slide into your messages with, "Hey, I've been thinking about you," or "You look really happy," or "You look really happy," or "Can we talk?" You see it for what it is. It's not reconciliation, it's reconnaissance. They're not checking on you. They're checking if the rules they've been living by are actually real, or if you found a way to break them without consequences. They're studying you now, the way they should have trusted you then. And some of them, the really bold ones, they'll try to rewrite history. They'll claim they always believed in you. They'll say they knew you'd figure it out. They'll position themselves as supporters who were there all along, just quieter than the doubters. But you remember who was silent when silence felt like abandonment. You remember who questioned when you needed certainty. You remember who stayed and who ran when your life looked like a disaster movie to everyone watching. But here's the beautiful part. Here's the part that makes all of it worth it. You don't need them to rewrite history because you're too busy writing the future. You don't need them to admit they were wrong because you're too focused on being right about what comes next. You don't need their validation now because you learned to validate yourself when their approval was the only currency you thought you needed. Let's talk about the pattern they're starting to recognize. Because this isn't the first time you've done this, is it? This isn't the first time you've made a move that looked questionable and turned it into something undeniable. You have a history of this, a track record of seeing around corners that haven't been built yet, a reputation, whether they acknowledge it or not, for being right in ways that take time to prove. You were the person who called the breakup before anyone else saw the cracks. You're the person who left the party early before it turned into a mess everyone regrets. You're the person who walked away from opportunities that looked golden but smelled wrong and then watched those opportunities rust in real time. Clears throat. You have instincts that operate faster than their logic, and that's always been your advantage in their confusion. They process through committees. You process through clarity. They need consensus. You need truth. They move when it's safe. You move when it's right. And that difference, that fundamental difference in operating systems, it creates a lag. They're always seeing your moves in retrospect, analyzing your decisions after the outcomes are already visible, wondering how you knew when there was no way to know. But you did know. You always know. Not because you're psychic, not because you're lucky, but because you've learned to listen to the frequency they've tuned out. You hear the whispers underneath the words. You see the patterns underneath the chaos. You feel the shifts before the ground starts moving. They call it intuition, like it's magic. You know, it's just paying attention at a level that most people find exhausting. And that's why your crazy was calculated, because you were calculating with data they couldn't perceive. Clears throat. You were running equations that included variables they didn't believe existed. You were solving for outcomes they couldn't imagine because they'd never allowed themselves to want something that far outside the script. Your math looked like madness because they couldn't see the numbers you were working with. Now, let's talk about what happens next, because recognition is just the beginning. Now that they see you were right, now that they realize your breakdown was actually a breakthrough, they're going to want something from you. They're going to want the formula. They're going to want the shortcut. They're going to want you to translate your instinct into instructions they can follow without having to develop that instinct themselves. And here's where you have to be careful. Here's where the real test begins, because it's tempting to teach. It's tempting to explain. It's tempting to take every person who doubted you and turn them into a student just to prove you were always the teacher. But not everyone deserves your wisdom. Not everyone has earned access to your process. Some people want your results without your risk. Some people want your clarity without your chaos. You don't owe them the map. You don't owe them the breakdown of every decision that led you here. You don't owe them the privilege of understanding what they refuse to trust. Some lessons are only meant for the people who learn them in the fire, not the people who show up after the smoke clears, asking how you survived the flames. Your story is yours. Your strategy is yours. Your madness, your genius, your calculated chaos, it's all yours. But for the ones who were there, for the ones who stayed quiet when they didn't understand, but didn't question your sanity, for the ones who gave you space when you needed distance and didn't make it about them, those people that get to see behind the curtain, those people earn the right to know how you did it. Not because they supported you perfectly, but because they supported you imperfectly without trying to stop you. And here's what you can tell them. Here's what you can share with the people who actually deserve to know. You didn't have a plan. You had a compass. You didn't follow steps. You followed truth. You didn't calculate every outcome. You calculated the cost of staying the same and decided any risk was better than that certain death. You didn't know it would work. You knew doing nothing definitely wouldn't. You trusted yourself in the dark. You believed your instincts over their advice. You chose your peace over their understanding. You valued your future over their comfort. And every time you made a choice that looked insane, you were really making a choice between two versions of yourself. The one they wanted you to be and the one you needed to become. You chose yourself every single time. And that choice, that consistent choosing of yourself, even when it looked selfish, even when it felt lonely, even when you had no proof it would lead anywhere good, that's the genius they're recognizing now. That's the calculation they're finally seeing. You bet on yourself when you were the longest shot in the room. You invested in your own vision when no one else could see it. You held the line when everyone else was telling you to retreat. Now they want to know how you had that kind of faith. They want to know where that certainty came from. They want to know what made you so sure when everything looked so uncertain. And the answer is going to disappoint them because it's too simple. The answer is you weren't sure. You were committed. There's a difference. Certainty is knowing the outcome. Commitment is moving forward without it. You didn't know it would work. Clears throat. You decided it had to. You didn't know you'd survive. You decided survival was non-negotiable. You didn't know you'd win. You decided losing wasn't an option you'd entertain. And that decision, that refusal to accept the version of your life where you stayed small, where you played safe, where you died slowly in comfort, that was the real calculation. Let's go even deeper. Let's talk about the specific moments they called that you knew were necessary. Remember when you stopped explaining yourself? When you just started moving without the mandatory press conference about your intentions? They called it secretive. They called it suspicious. Some of them called it arrogant. But you knew something they didn't. You knew that explanation dilutes execution. You knew that every time you justified your moves to people who couldn't see your vision, you were giving them ammunition to talk you out of it. You knew that their questions weren't coming from curiosity, but from fear, and their fear was contagious. So you stopped speaking their language. You stopped translating your future into terms they could understand. You let your actions do the talking, and you let time do the teaching. And when you walked away from people without closure, without the dramatic final conversation, without the tidy ending they thought they deserved, they called it cold. They called it cruel. They said you ghosted like you were the villain in their story. But you knew something about closure. They didn't. You knew that some doors don't need to be ceremonially shut. Some doors just need to be left behind while you keep walking. You knew that the closure conversation they wanted was really just another attempt to change your mind, to plant doubt, to make you second guesses the knowing that lived in your bones. So, you denied them that opportunity. You protected your decision by refusing to defend it. You honored your choice by not putting it up for debate. And that was genius masquerading as coldness. When you disappeared from social media, when you stopped performing your life for an audience that was watching you like a reality show, they said you were isolating. They said you were cutting yourself off. They diagnosed you with everything from depression to delusion because you stopped giving them contempt to consume, but you were doing something they couldn't comprehend. You were remembering who you were before you became a character in everyone else's story. You were shedding the performance. You were killing the avatar. You are finding the version of yourself that existed before you learned to shapeshift for survival. And that process, that brutal, beautiful process of unbecoming everything you're not, it requires silence. It requires absence. It requires absence. It requires you to be so unavailable to their narratives that you can finally hear your own voice underneath all the noise. They called it crazy because your absence made them uncomfortable. It made them question why they needed your presence to validate their own existence. It made them wonder what you were doing in that silence that was so much more important than maintaining your position in their social ecosystem. And the answer they couldn't know because you weren't performing it is you were healing, you were building, you were becoming. Now let's address the moment that really confused them. The moment you stopped fighting. Remember when you used to argue back? When you used to defend your perspective, correct their misunderstandings, prove your point until they had no choice but to see your side. And then one day you just stopped. You let them think whatever they wanted. You let their version of events stand uncorrected. You let them be wrong about you in public while you focused on being right about yourself in private. They thought you'd given up. They thought you'd accepted their narrative. Some of them thought they'd finally broken you into submission, but you hadn't surrendered. You'd transcended. You realized that their opinion of you was none of your business. You realized that defending yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you was like trying to teach physics to a brick wall. Possible in theory, pointless in practice. So, you withdrew your energy from that battlefield. You stopped fighting for your reputation in the court of people who'd already made their judgment. You let them have their wrong story because you were too busy living the right one. And that selective silence,